Our first speaker in this second part of the afternoon, or morning in Scott's case, is Scott Klasky, who is, let me see, Group Leader for Scientific Data, Computer Science and Mathematics Division at Oak Ridge National Labs in Tennessee. And he's going to talk to us about exascale data management using ADIOS and all the different aspects of I/O. And I guess that means all kinds of data management these days, not just the sort of classic two-disk storage that we kind of think of. Scott.
Okay, thank you. I hope you can hear me, and I hope you'll be able to hear some of the sound in the videos. So today I'll talk a lot about data and data management. My PhD was actually in black hole physics, and one of the things I'll talk a lot about is our interactions with applications. This is an exascale meeting, and I'll mention the 3 exascale projects I'm on: ADIOS, which is an I/O framework you'll hear a lot about; KSTAR, the Co-Design Center for Online Data Analysis and Reduction, things we've heard about reduction; and the WDMApp, which is a fusion exascale project. I'm also representing the WarpX ECP project a little bit. We're on there, along with the climate exascale project, where we're also playing a small part. So let me just continue saying we've had a lot of contributors, and ADIOS and a lot of the technology that we develop and research in my group is because of so many contributions. So just to get into what we think about with exascale and extreme scale data, we talk a lot about this abstraction about moving data, and we move data from, say, a live experiment around the world and try to get near real-time analysis. And we need to do this efficiently. So we look at large data, and you've heard the SKA, which we work with, they have huge amounts of data. Or when we look at fusion, there's all different requirements, and we want to be able to, if we want to say manage, to think about the constraints on storage, bandwidth, the timeliness constraints, how to get things reusable, how to make things easy for scientists to work with, to integrate into various workflow engines and runtime systems. And we're trying to provide tools that hide so much of this complexity to really allow science to get done. So we are typically partners, and what we look at is ways so that, like we mentioned, the SKA paper, which was done from one of the scientists in my group. This was when I was invited over to go to Perth into this radio astronomy field, and basically they said, we have a data problem, can you work with us? And then one of the PhD students, Jason, for the first author of the Gordon Bell paper, he started working with this, seeing he could do so many things in their science, and then he came over and joined my group. Similarly, we work with fusion energy, global tomography, and you'll see that we're on their papers. We contribute to their science, they contribute to our science. We write computer science papers, we write, you'll see Ozan is on this paper where we work in data reduction. So software and sustainability is a really important thing. And I think for any type of exascale meeting, one of the things is you have to know that the software is well tested. For ADIOS, we have almost 2,000 tests for each commit. We test at all different scales, because what we find is things that work at, say, a few processes or work on some systems, you'll find it doesn't work when you work on, say, 1 million processors, or when you're doing streaming across to hundreds of different publishers and subscribers. So there's so much testing that you have to do. With that being said, I'll say one of the things that motivates us is this trend of larger, the capturing of the generation of data from these systems keeps getting larger. And when ADIOS started, I was working in fusion energy, working with a code called GTC. And at the time in 99, 2000, we were generating 1 terabyte of data per run, per simulation day. And we needed the I/O to work quickly, and we needed to integrate visualization analysis so that we can capture your instabilities, we can stop the simulation. So these have become important parts along the way, and we really work with sustainability to make sure that when we have a release, things work, but we continually strive to do better, especially as the machines become more diverse, as we've gone over to these GPU accelerators, and as we're going further to next generation machines, like the next one at Oak Ridge, a 1.5 exaflop machine Frontier, which is currently being assembled. So our vision is really about I/O. It's data movement. And we say we are publish subscribe. So you can have an experiment. It's publishing several variables. You can think of a variable being temperature or pressure. That may be generated from multiple sensors. It could be generated from a MPI application or an AI application. So there's the producer and then the consumers. A consumer can be analytics. So when we look at our strategy, we want to make sure whether we're working with the spatial neutron source at Oak Ridge, and that's trying to get things similar to what I heard with Diamond, where we're trying to capture what's going on, have that data stream over to our supercomputer or our clusters, analyze, and then have some feedback, this near real time. And you need to do things efficient. The other thing that we know with storage is that it's multi-tiered. On a machine like Summit, we have node, local, and NVMe. Some people like to call it burst buffers. We have also a parallel file system. And then the thing that sometimes a lot of my colleagues forget is we have tape. How do we think of this as a multi-tiered storage system? And how do we abstract things away so that users can use this? So you can stream the more important pieces of data together. You can do things efficiently. So we have, for ADIOS, multiple engines. So if someone says, when you write the storage, is that the same technology as when we stream to do some strong mathematical coupling? And it's no, it's the abstraction is the same. You don't change your code, but then this little switch is different of what you use for the engine. And that's how we can get high performance for so many different things. ADIOS is open source. It's contributed from many different people. And we can show so many codes where they're writing huge amounts of data or reading huge amounts of data, and they're getting terabytes per second to a file system. This is not the node, local, NVMe. So ADIOS separates out the approach. So the I/O calls are declarative in nature. So basically, you can think of each process knows what it's writing, or you have a sensor, it knows about what it has. But then there's some global knowledge about what's happening globally. You may know it, you may not, but you try to put that in. There's another concept of ADIOS called a step. In a simulation, it's pretty simple. You can have a time iteration scheme, or you can have something which is just iterations on, say, an elliptic solve. And these steps basically separate out data for these different time epochs. The same way as we work with experiments. So when we work with some fusion experiments with a megahertz camera, we basically separate out a millisecond of data and call the millisecond data from all the sensors a step. And now we say the strategy of the I/O separated from the user. So all the internals, like people who have played around with luster, they think of things in terms of luster, of all the knowledge you have to have. With ADIOS, we separate that out from users so that you don't have to do anything. There's no hacks around. And what we find when we work with people with codes, like in climate, there's so much that we have to remove of the hacks they were doing to try to get performance, just completely remove it so that we can get high performance. And it really makes it so that users try to just then choose the right method. Again, think of it as an input parameter, and you don't modify your code. So this allows developers to create new methods and really push new methods to applications so that you can just try it out without changing your code and see if it works. And again, I mentioned there's these things of variables. There's attributes to put more metadata, and that's really to help with the fairness. And our goals are really to make sure that we can make things easy, we can make things highly scalable and high performant, and we can make it well integrated into the tool change of application scientists. This is just showing a couple performance numbers, just showing again, very high performance for 2 real fusion codes. And these are, I'm not going to say every ADIOS API, but these are the most basic ones, the ones that most scientists would use. And you don't have to learn that many. And what you'll see is you have a get for reading or subscribing to data, and you'll have a put for publishing the data. And then you can inquire, you can query, and then you'll see things wrapped around begin step and end step. So if you had a simulation that generated 1,000 steps, between every unique step, you would have the begin step, end step put for many of your variables. The same one when you're reading, you can then read it. And this allows, like my colleague Dave Pugmire will talk tomorrow, to create visualization services. And then there's a schema that goes on top, which will then define the variables and make sure this works. But as we talk about with so much data, similar to what happens in video compression, we need to prioritize things so that if you want fast analysis, so say it's simulation and you want to get a really fast view, if it's a lot of data, you don't want to have to go through all the data. You want to refactor it in a way so that you can prioritize the high information count, go to a lower, a lower amount of degrees of freedom so that your visualization can be fairly accurate, but with a known error bound. And I believe Ozan will talk more about this. But this allows you to then go further, just like JPEG 2000, but with error bars that are known, and known not just for the quantity that you're moving, but also these quantities of interest, meaning the downstream processing. If you're going to compute a derivative or an energy spectrum, you can know what the error is. And that allows you to deal and cope with much more data. And it also allows you, this is just showing a storage, and it's just saying things on the bottom can be tape, on top it can be your fast NVMe storage, and along the way it can be different types of HPC and cloud storage. Now, let's just go through a few things. The GTC code. So we've worked with them for many years, and it's been hard. It was hard to get them to switch until finally, once again, they were struggling. This is actually going through a tau trace of what was going on in their code. And, it's a particle and cell code. Most of the time should be pushing particles and then depositing the particles to the cells. But what you'll see is that most of the time was spent in I/O. And we were able to do many things with ADIOS to do this. Now, to describe it further, I have this little video of Zihong Lin, the author of this code from UC Irvine.
This is what reason ADIOS team that help GTC, and I borrowed one slide from Scott's group to highlight this. So the GTC code has been selected to perform the 2022 theory performance target by DOE to predict the alpha particle confinement in ether burning plasma. That requires thousands of times more computational resource than the example I show for the D3D simulations. So by enabling GTC with the ADIO framework, we can finally write out all the majority of particle data with minimum impact to the code performance, and show by Scott.
Now I'm going to share the slides so you'll be able to download this. So I'm going to cut my friend Zihong off. But what you'll see is we work together and we're trying to solve the problem. In this case, this is for the energetic particle confinements. So similarly, we work with global tomography. And in this case, what they're trying to do is really get a detailed 3D model of the Earth's interior, which shows the entire globe. And in their case, they are incredibly limited with data. Their code is called SPEC-FEM 3D Globe, if you've heard of it. It's a very well-known code used around the world, and it is incredibly data intensive. In fact, when they first came to us, they were told they must work with us from our computing center because they were crashing our file system. And in the newer runs, they are talking about 7.5 petabytes of data in a single workflow step. That's several hours of run. So in here, what we're showing is that we were able to reduce their I/O for, in this case, 266 terabytes of data per 50 tasks. And we're able to reduce the time for I/O to 156 seconds. Some of this is described here.
It's about 2 petabytes of files we have to dump into the the file system and then be read back into the agent simulations. So some performance metric about ADIOS on Summit. So we finished a few different kind of tests. The first one is stress test. So we perform about 50 earthquakes. It takes about 80% of the Summit computing power. And in total, it dumps about 250 terabytes of files into the file system. And we compile different methods for the ADIOS 1 version. So you can see the POSIX and MPI grid give similar performance. And then recently we just migrate to ADIOS 2. And we also did.
So I'll stop and just say again, when you compute the numbers, you're getting over 2 terabytes per second going to GPFS for their simulation. And again, since they're so limited by performance and I/O performance, this is very important to them. Similarly, we work with laser plasma accelerator. In this case, we work with the Exascale project WarpX. This is looking at using these small accelerators and using a beat wave in order to accelerate particles. And we did a lot of work in order to help them first write at scale. The logic contiguous, this was actually running with HDF5, if you're familiar. This is a logarithmic scale. And as they scale, what you can see is the throughput between ADIOS, that's the green, and the blue. I mean, we're talking orders of magnitude. Now with HDF5, you could improve the write performance by increasing chunking. The other thing that you won't really hear so much about us is reading performance. And when they wrote, just in terms of one time slice, their entire domain of 256 gigs, you generally find logic contiguous will give you the best performance. So HDF5 was really good performance. Well, this system, though, had 32 cores per node. And once you used all the cores to read and then process the data, visualize the data, you'll see green again, ADIOS was faster. And by using 4 nodes, reading time is almost like nothing. So you can just essentially make things so fast when you use some concurrency. The same is for different types of reading patterns. Now, my friend Axel can describe this more.
In recent work with the ADIOS 2 team, we improved the write performance of WarpX. We started from already a pretty strong baseline, which was already using subfiles on a parallel file system to achieve fast writes. And what we compare on the left-hand side is an implementation of plot files that uses the subfile method compared to ADIOS BP groups where you create subfiles per rank and step. As we found out, creating more and more files over the course of simulation is actually creating quite some overhead. And so we mitigated this problem by appending to existing files per rank
I'll advance him.
Bridge and address all needs that we have. Specifically, with mesh refinement and sophisticated load balancing in WarpX and AMRX, as you can see on the left-hand side, we can create quite a lot of chunks that we write out to disk and that go into zap files. And realistic read patterns that we visualize here in the middle can actually create totally different requirements for data layouts to be efficient. So for example, a layout that reads perfectly in alignment order can be perfect for logically contiguous data, to read it once and go straight through the data. But if you read actually a slice in the opposite directions, the situation of read performance looks totally different. And what we found out is that, well, we can actually research and try to bridge these gaps by doing a merging algorithm.
So I'll just go further to say, so what we did was apply algorithms with adaptive rest refinement in order to aggregate grids. We used that into ADIOS to aggregate the data to then write. And through that, as Axel would have explained, this allows us to then get this extreme performance for reading. So we've also worked a lot with the climate code for ECP, the E3SM. And in here, what you'll see is that the ADIOS times throughput can greatly help their case. And this allows their high resolution runs to go further. So one of the climate scientists will tell you a little bit about this.
On the right, you can see the I/O performance of E3SM with ADIOS 2. On the top, there.
Oh, my apologies, incorrect graph. Let me just go further.
Of E3SM with ADIOS 2. On the top, the results are from Corey, and the results at the bottom are from Summit. As you can see, we have tried atmosphere, land, and ocean simulations with multiple resolutions.
Let me just quickly say, so we can get much better performance. And these are similar to SKA, and we've already heard an SKA talk. So I don't think I need to go through Andreas's description of SKA, other than to say, again, I'll give, we'll have these slides so you can download. And there's a lot of things that we have to do to process, to write, to read the data very efficiently if we're going to work with the huge data from SKA. But data is not just the storage. It's all about then also the publishing and subscribing, the streaming, and the coupling of the different codes. So in these cases, what we'll do is we'll use different engines of ADIOS. The engines you saw commonly were BP4 and some of these others. We're currently going to release a new BP5 to get even more performance for certain cases. But for streaming, we use these engines of SSC, which is using one-sided MPIs if you're on the same machine, or SSTs, which uses RDMA, and it allows for separate executables on a machine like Summit or any HPC machine to run together. And that way, when there's a visualization service or analysis service, if they crash, your code doesn't crash. So we have, a lot of work that we've been doing for the last 10 years. And one of the things we do is use this for mathematical strong coupling. So in the mathematical coupling, you can think of this case, there's two codes, Gene and XGC. There's a kinetic coupling of these codes, and that's just using ADIOS SST along with data that comes from Tau, and Tau can publish in ADIOS. And then you can use near real-time analysis to subscribe using visualization. You can reduce the data on even separate nodes. And these processes are just separate MPI programs written by different authors, and you can put them in a workflow and then strongly mathematically couple these together to make sure that these work well together. My friend C.S. Chang can describe it all.
How is ADIOS being used to enable
1 minute, yes.
Okay, great. To enable the XCC science. XCC, the same as WDMApp, uses up to trillions of Markov particles on Summit for a few thousands time steps to study ITER. If I calculate this, at the moment we do a simplified less number of particles. Data size per time step is ranging from 10 to hundreds terabytes, and per day it's up to hundreds petabytes on Summit. And there's no way we can to analyze this with post-processing. ADIOS enabled us actually to have the all this simulation possible starting from huge restart file. Before ADIOS, it was taking an hour for an hour simulation. That was really impossible to get simulation done. Now it's only a few minutes for this restart file. And the physics file cannot be really, we cannot really output the physics analysis file out of this. So we use ADIOS 2 for on-memory real-time streaming data analysis. Compression and visualization is what we do and what we are after. On-memory multi-scale time integration, since these are short time scale, to extend this simulation to experimental time scale is also being pursued via ADIOS 2. It's been a few years. construction of a digital twin with synthetic diagnostics from simulation for near real-time ADIOS communication with experiment is another goal we have together with the ADIOS team. So just to finish up, how is ADIOS being used to enable WDMApp in ECP project? You can see that in the core, there's another gyrokinetic code. And then in the edge, we have the XGC code. We have interface, we couple codes. And there'll be more codes after ECP is done. MHD, heating, energetic particles, wall interactions. All these will be done using ADIOS 2 and coupling.
I'll just continue to say, so these technologies can also be used during hyperparameter searching. In this case, we were working with Arvind, a researcher at Oregon Lab, and he was actually researching with COVID using a workflow system by Shantanu Jha called Radical. And they were starting to see that so much of their performance was because of the data.
Especially in the context of streaming AI. And the way we do that is by implementing ADIOS MDS, which allows us to stream the MD simulation data continuously within the context of this learning loop that I just spoke to you about in the previous slide. And the streaming application of ML and AI is kind of running all the time. So there is it's running as if it's an infinite loop and the decisions are made online as the model learns. And we are constantly training or retraining and then allowing the model to evolve over time. So with respect to a file system implementation, we can sort of compare the sorts of benefits we get. Yes, of course, in terms of the sample states, we see the same amount of benefits. We can actually increase the order of magnitude acceleration by about 100 times. And the resource utilization is something where ADIOS actually helps us a lot, which is that you can actually see that many of the resources that are being used, they're not idle as compared to the file system-based implementation, where many of the resources are actually spending time waiting for data to come in or waiting for more data to be generated and so on. So this enables us to get up.
Okay, so I'll just continue. So the same technology can be used when we actually have data. This is the fusion reactor KSTAR. It's in Daejeon, Korea. And what we've been trying to do is this near real-time analysis, things that you've heard in some of the other talks, like how do you make sure that during these expensive experiments, we can move and process the data. In this case, what we found is moving the data over from Korea to the US, there is latency, but we're talking about not a lot. It's not a huge amount of time compared to the time it takes in processing. And here we can go from 12 hours to 10 minutes. My friend Michael Churchill can describe
connecting these experimental fusion devices to HPC centers in order to enable more detailed and better analysis of the various diagnostics, and also connecting it with simulations in a time scale that's what we call near real time, such that on this kind of 10 minutes setting, we can get information back to the operators of the machine such that they can do a better setup for the next shot. So how do we use ADIOS with this? ADIOS has capabilities.
For the sake of time, I'll just continue on.
And Delta uses ADIOS 2's WAN transfer capabilities to transfer data at about 4 gigabits per second from the KSTAR tokamak in Korea over to the Cori supercomputer at NERSC. This is all built on ADIOS 2 Python bindings, as we were trying to have.
And I'll continue for the sake of time. So during this, when you find you can just move extreme amounts of data, you need to be able to refactor, in other words, prioritize the higher information content. And this is the work that we've done with Mark Ensworth from Brown, Ozon, and many other researchers in order to say, how do we prioritize this, but with known error bounds? I already had one slide. I'll say we can get then ways to say when we have complex quantities of interest, meaning things that most physicists will know, things like density or temperature in both the parallel and perpendicular direction. So these are linear and nonlinear quantities of interest. Off this complex data, we need to make sure that we can actually go with this high dimensional, this is 5-dimension plus time data, to get high compression ratios, in this case from this code XGC, to get with errors in quantity of interest what the scientists want of 10 to minus 3. What you can see is that our compression ratio with all of our optimizations, which is the graph below, our compression ratio is roughly 76. And this is actually a really wonderful number, because when we're talking about petabytes of data, reducing by 76, but ensuring that all the errors in your quantities of interest can be mathematically proved to be in this range is very important.
From these experiments, which is you.
This is the summary, in some sense, from one of my colleagues in the Helmholtz Institute in Dresden about where we're going together. I'll let him talk.
From these experiments, which is usually scattering data, so not real data that directly shows us the position of all particles, but we basically have to make an inverse Fourier transform, something of this like from the scattering data. We need to do forward simulations that come as close as possible to the real experiments. And that's where ADIOS comes in first. We need to do a simulation of the X-ray laser, of our high power laser, of the system we're looking at, and of the detector. So coupling those different simulations together. And that's where ADIOS comes from, using the OpenPMD standard that's set on top of ADIOS to really stream data from simulation to simulation and run several simulations in an HPC system. The next thing is to actually build surrogate models, because at the time of the experiment, we can't use these large-scale simulations. We can use them to plan the experiment, but not really to run those simulations while we're at the experiment, because they're too demanding. We would need a large-scale HPC system. So we built an AI surrogate model of this. And again, we can use ADIOS to stream the data from the large-scale HPC system to the AI system that's learning what this simulation.
So I won't let him finish because of
from these
time. What I'll say is that just the summary is that what I hoped I showed is that we work with applications, we partner with applications, we spend huge amounts of time to be able to look at this. When we partner with new scientists, I have this quote that comes from someone, I didn't want to put their name yet, but they were looking at, in my old field of general relativity, something from a code called the Einstein Toolkit, and they're replacing their AMR. And you can see in the quote, again, they need to improve the I/O performance. We're in science, and science is all about data. And we want to be able to make sure that all the data can have enough provenance, enough metadata along the way. But because it's so much, we need to make it fair. And we also need to be able to separate the information content so that we can write the higher information content on the more expensive and faster storage. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Scott. There's a couple of questions have come in the question and answer. And I was just wondering, actually, watching your talk, whether you could perhaps just give a sort of summary of the insight you've had over the years of how ADIOS has become faster than the other I/O libraries that you can get, and just the improvements you've made over the years, obviously from ADIOS 1 to ADIOS 2. What's the key insight that's improves your throughput?
Well, there's so much detailed engineering that goes to this, but one of the first things that I did was look at how do you get high write performance and how do you get high read performance. There's so much about concurrency, all things that you've learned in I/O, that you're writing to a big disk and it's one big storage unit. Well, they're separate disks. Everything you learn in parallel computing and distributed computing, it's concurrency. How do you both make use of locality? So many of the techniques have been thinking about locality have been thinking about how we use memory in its most optimal way. How do we trade off some of these aspects? And again, it's been more engineering process. How do we move data efficiently from RDMA techniques or use the best of one-sided MPI? There are fundamental algorithmic reasons why ADIOS is faster. One could probably mathematically prove that, but I'll let my mathematical colleagues mathematically prove it, but I'll say it's all in the algorithms, and you have to be willing to fundamentally change the structure when you see that you have a flaw in the algorithm or the technology is changing. And through the years, I mean, we've seen concurrency go through the roof. Look at how many disks that we use to get high levels of concurrency and storage. The changes as we go to NVMe. So I saw a question about ADIOS. Well, that will be a new engine, and we'll see what happens. We've worked with many other technologies which sort of, you know, have they made it? And I'll say, like, you know, again, we have to make sure it works for all different types of technologies, such as ADIOS. They're new engines, and if you're on that machine, then we can give you more optimal results. I hope I answered some of the questions. There's another about code adaptation. You know, what I'll say is, if you've ever programmed things like NetCDF or HDF5, pretty much it's going to be a lot easier. It's, you know, especially compared to HDF5, it's tremendously easier. Our number of functions is much, much less. And I tried to show, if you know, you can look at a lot of codes, there's not that many functions that we have. So we tried to take things away from application developers so that under the engine, with some intention, some extra hints you can provide, you can get much higher levels of performance.
Okay, thanks, Scott. That's great. I think what you just said about concurrency is really interesting, and would be something for everyone to take away, actually, and to think about quite deeply, really.